Really excited to hear from our next speaker, Dr. Shireen Rahimi. Shireen, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. This is really cool. I always get really excited when I get to be in a room full of people who care about the ocean and care about making a difference on climate as much as I do. This work can be exhausting, so it's very nourishing to my spirit, and it's really cool because everyone who's spoken today, I hear them saying things that I have said myself on stage or I have thought myself. So I'm going to touch on a lot of those themes again, and it's nice to know that we're all on the same page because these problems are really complex and we're going to need to kind of be on the same page to address them. As an underwater visual storyteller and a marine scientist, I spend most of my time going underwater with my camera to tell stories about how we can restore our relationships with our oceans and our climate. This work has taken me to the Coral Triangle in Indonesia, pulsing with life, to last year's record-breaking heat wave in the Florida Keys, marked by mass coral mortality. Face to face with wildlife suffering at our hands. And just last week, to the waters of the Red Sea to film the most resilient coral reefs on the planet. And making some very cute friends along the way. A lot of people ask me how I got here. How did a Middle Eastern girl from the suburbs in California end up becoming obsessed with ocean storytelling? I grew up in Northern California, a very first-generation Iranian American, a very smiley kid whose favorite weekends were those spent at the beach. I've loved photography for as long as I can remember, but like a typical child of immigrants, I thought that if I wanted to be successful, I'd have to be a doctor, an engineer, or a scientist. Photography would just have to be a hobby. But my parents also instilled in me a love for the natural world. Poems were passed down in my family that taught me Sufi philosophies, glorifying nature as the ultimate teacher. Poets like Rumi and Hafez. I ended up studying environmental science because it seemed to me like the most obvious path to spending most of my time in nature, this place where everything just felt right and good. But as I went through my studies, I started to realize that there might be ways for me to combine my passion for photography with science. In 2017, I was doing my PhD at the University of Miami. For my field work, I was studying how the Obama administration's normalization of relations with Cuba would lead to tourism impacts on their coral reefs. I was seeing some really incredible underwater places, and I knew I had to figure out a way to take photos underwater so I could share the wonder of these places and why they need to be protected with others. So I applied for a National Geographic grant to create a film about my work there. I received the grant and immediately ran around my house screaming, and then spent all the money on an underwater camera, taught myself how to use it, and have been obsessed ever since. I realize now that I didn't just find something that I love to do. I was overcome with the undeniable power of environmental storytelling. Visual storytelling is the most powerful medium that we have to drive social change. The reason why we're in this climate emergency in the first place is because the powers that be have been telling us the wrong story. The story goes that nature is separate from humans, and humans must dominate nature. We need to start telling new stories that reflect the kind of world that we want to live in. And our new story has to center the ocean. The powerful solutions that our oceans hold for climate have been underestimated for far too long, because our oceans are bearing the brunt of impacts around climate. They absorb 25% of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere, and 90% of the excess heat that those emissions create. They provide food to over 3 billion people, and they regulate the climate that sustains our ways of life. They're basically an incredible buffer system, keeping our planet on life support. But because it's so vast, dense, and fluid, the ocean takes its time. Its reactions are delayed. just like when you're steering a boat and your movements have a bit of lag time. Because of this, so many of the impacts on our climate on our oceans have been locked in and will continue to bear out over time. And short of some wild geoengineering miracle, there's nothing that we can do to change it. In less than a decade working with the oceans, I've seen these dramatic changes firsthand. For example, much of my work is focused on tropical coral reefs because tropical coral reefs are the earliest and most severe ecological casualties of climate change. So my practice often involves documenting the impacts of warming seas, which last year led to a mass coral bleaching right in my backyard in Miami. This was part of the 4th global bleaching event in history, meaning it's the 4th time that we've seen corals bleach en masse in every ocean basin in the world at the same time. These trends are only going to get worse. I've seen the impacts of overfishing. So many reefs, from the Caribbean to the South Pacific, that are beautiful, but silent, fished into empty versions of their former selves. And of course, sea level rise. This is the view from my balcony in South Beach, where my neighbor has literally put trash bags around his legs so he could wade through 1.5 feet of water to get to his car. We didn't have a storm this day. This is ocean water seeping up through a vent in the parking lot. Some projections show that by 2060, more of Miami will be underwater than not. These consequences have been baked into our oceans and into our atmosphere as well. So much of what we experience in the next century will be because of the emissions and biodiversity loss that we've already inflicted. I know this talk is getting dark, and it's going to get a little bit darker right now, but just bear with me for a second because I think it'll be more productive if I'm honest with you all. As a scientist, I face the facts every day. We're headed for a planetary catastrophe, one that will completely transform our lives beyond recognition. It'll likely lead to billions of deaths, masses of climate refugees, and an extinction event of dramatic proportions. That's a lot to take in, so let's sit with that pain. The thought of catastrophe is painful, but while catastrophe is inevitable, so is transformation. We now know that reducing carbon emissions is incredibly important, but we can't just do that and call it a day. This would be addressing the symptoms and not the cause. To meaningfully navigate this climate crisis, and as people have said this before, we need to fundamentally restructure our economies. Can I have a scroll down, please? Thank you. As of now, our systems are designed to exploit human labor, which leads to the devaluation of life and the destruction of both natural and cultural diversity. So what is the solution? We need to shift our economies completely towards equity, community, and a recognition of the fundamental sacredness of life. We've been the key drivers of destruction, and like Cyril said, it's now time that we shift to become the key drivers of creation, of restoration. This is where the ocean comes in. It's the great equalizer. Here are a couple ocean solutions that can help us mitigate the worst and come out the other side of this catastrophe with something to show for ourselves. Blue carbon. Blue carbon refers to ecosystems like mangroves, seagrasses, and marshes that naturally absorb carbon from the atmosphere into their sediment. They're like free, incredible carbon sponges. These ecosystems are often thought of as tools for reducing carbon emissions. But the way blue carbon works is actually widely misunderstood. We can't depend on these ecosystems to absorb all of our carbon because they do so on short geological timescales, from days to centuries, before natural factors like storms can release it again. They can't significantly offset carbon emissions the way that using less fossil fuels can, because fossil fuels store carbon for hundreds of millions of years. So no, sadly, companies can't buy blue carbon credits to offset their fossil fuel emissions and expect that to make a big difference. But protecting these ecosystems is vital not just because they sequester carbon, because they do, but because they provide critical habitat for fish and marine species, they clean the water, and they provide coastal communities with food and protection from increasingly extreme weather events that are getting more extreme because of climate change. Planting mangroves won't sequester enough carbon to save the world, but protecting and restoring blue carbon ecosystems is important because they're one way that we can actively redesign the way that we relate to each other and to our planet. Regenerative ocean farming. The biggest myth I hear about commercial fishing is that we overfish because there are just too many mouths to feed on this planet. That's just not true. In reality, if properly fished and managed, our oceans could provide over 6 times more food than they do right now. The commercial fishing industry uses illegal, industrial, and honestly disgusting practices to bring us our seafood. I've seen some of it firsthand, and I haven't eaten fish since. But if the ocean gives us so much, even as we pillage it, imagine how much it could provide if we harvested it sustainably. And one of the best ways to do this is through regenerative ocean farming. This type of farming cultivates protein sources like mussels, oysters, and seaweed. The production of meat contributes to about 14% of total annual emissions. That number is huge. Deriving protein from regenerative ocean farming, on the other hand, does not emit any net carbon, and it's healthier for you too. These ocean solutions give me hope not only because they reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, but because they offer a new vision for how we can relate to the natural world. Because if we can fix the ways that we relate to nature and to each other, reducing emissions won't feel like a sacrifice. It'll feel like an obvious imperative. And that's why I'm proud to be here and to work with organizations like SailGP and Parlay. Honestly, I've never heard of a sports league where athletes compete not only to win races, but to win for people and planet. Imagine if our governments, our markets worked in the same way. It's a beautiful example of the direction we need to head in if we want to actually make real change. Thinking outside the box and transforming our systems so that they benefit nature and humans alike. The ocean can provide us with everything we need to survive if we just let it. The technology and solutions exist, and they're backed by science. They're economically viable, and they represent our path towards not only a low-carbon future, but an equitable one. So, what can everyone in this room do to do their part? We can all commit to acting in line with our values, our innate desires to give our children the best possible future. Whatever position of power you hold, whatever skill you possess, whatever changes you can make, just do it. Because when we act based on our values, we heal ourselves. Dark days lie ahead, but whenever I think of the dark days, I think of this poem from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the ancient Persian poet. This dome not fretted by the lapse of days, and unaffected by our joy or grief, does not rest, but turns still, not perishing like us, altered, yet complete. This poem was written over 1,000 years ago, and these lines remind me that our predicament is not a new one. The Earth has seen dramatic transformation before. It's just that this is the first time that humans are around to cause it, to witness it, and to experience its consequences. It's our job to let go of the things we can't control and fight like hell for the things that we can, to ensure that this catastrophe transforms our society for the better. As Tim DeChristopher says, the fact that a catastrophe is coming doesn't mean that all hope was lost. It doesn't mean there's nothing left to fight for. It actually means that there's more to fight for than ever. Because that collapse could be an opportunity to build a better society on the ashes of this one. It could be an opportunity for mass reflection and to decide that maybe greed isn't the best value to be basing our civilization off of. And here, at least, is something worth hoping for. Thank you.
Amazing, Shireen.